Good evening, and welcome to your Ann Arbor District Library. My name is Steve, and I'm really happy to see all of you here for an evening with Anthony Marra. Couple quick housekeeping tips. There will be a time for questions at the end, so we'd ask that you would hold your questions for Mr. Marra until the end. Just to give him a little bit of introduction, he is the best-selling New York Times best-selling author of first A Constellation of Vital Phenomena and The Tsar of Love and Techno. Last year, he also published a third book, Mercury Pictures Presents, all of which have been New York Times bestsellers and have been noted as best books by NPR, Sunday Times, Book List, among others. And again, if you are interested in taking a look at either of those books, Literati is behind us at the table, and you are welcome to check them out and pick up those books. But without further ado, on behalf of Literati and your Ann Arbor District Library, Anthony Marra.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming out this evening. I know it's a beautiful day out, and I appreciate you all spending the evening here with me. It's a particular treat to be back in Ann Arbor to discuss this book, because this is where I read the first pages from this novel about 4 or 5 years ago. It was at that point I'd written only about a third of the book, and I wasn't sure if, how well it was working, and I sort of decided that that this would be where I would road test it, and so to return at the end of all of that is a real treat. And I should also say thank you to Literati and to the Ann Arbor Library for hosting this. I want to just take a quick moment to plug Literati's First Editions Club, which I am a big fan of. I am a subscriber. You get a bunch of cool, interesting first editions of forthcoming fiction. So I would highly recommend it to those of you who aren't members yet. Yeah, so what I will do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the world of this book. I'll read a couple of passages. Um, we'll take some questions. We'll have fun. I was chatting with my dad a couple of days ago and told him that I was going to be here, and he said to let everybody in Ann Arbor know that that I never had an overdue library book on his watch. And this was something he was quite proud of, because his first job was working at a library. When he was a teenager, he worked at the Brooklyn Public Library, and he got a job going door to door tracking down overdue library books. And this was in the 1950s, sort of before Brooklyn became quite as hip as it is now. And he was sort of this pint-sized bounty hunter, going along the waterfront, tracking down delinquent borrowers. So I'm very pleased to be here with you all tonight. Frank Lloyd Wright once said that if you tip the world on its side, all the loose pieces will land in Los Angeles. And this was probably never more true than it was in the 1930s and 40s, when thousands and thousands of refugees fleeing the war in Europe landed in LA. And many of them were artists and intellectuals, and this resulted in one of the great cultural transfusions in California history. In the Pacific Palisades, Thomas Mann was writing Dr. Faustus. On the backlot of Paramount Pictures, Billy Wilder was helping create film noir by combining German expressionist cinematography with hard-boiled American pulp. And of course, these encounters between highbrow emigre artists and Hollywood weren't always necessarily that productive. There's this great example involving the Austrian refugee composer Arnold Schoenberg and the producer of MGM, Irving Thalberg. Arnold Schoenberg was this uncompromising avant-garde composer. And Irving Thalberg, on the other hand, was the head of MGM. Schoenberg refused to pander to the tastes of the masses, and Irving Thalberg, as probably the most successful producer in Hollywood history, was a true genius at pandering to public tastes. There's a great example of that. So Paris is over 100 miles from the nearest coastline, right? It is geographically clearly not a city by the sea. But this fact of geography was not enough to persuade Irving Thalberg from cutting a romantic Parisian seascape scene from one of his movies. His assistants were bringing in maps and atlases showing that Paris was nowhere near the ocean, and his response to this was that he couldn't cater to the handful of people who know Paris. So Irving Thalberg was producing an adaptation of The Good Earth in the late 1930s, and he arranged a meeting to see if Arnold Schoenberg would be willing to write the score to that picture. The appointed hour came and went without the maestro's arrival. It turned out that when Arnold Schoenberg arrived to the MGM backlot, he joined a public tour of the studio, which he assumed had been set up in his honor, to see if MGM was the sort of place that somebody of his genius could work at. When Schoenberg finally got to Irving Thalberg's office, Thalberg began by making a terrible mistake. He complimented Schoenberg's music as lovely, and Schoenberg was deeply offended by this accusation. So after much mutual incomprehension, going back and forth, Schoenberg agreed to score to write the score to The Good Earth, but only on the condition that he also was allowed to control all of the dialogue and the pitches of every actor's voice. And Thalberg was a bit confused by this, and explained that usually this is the purview of the director and screenwriters and what have you. To which Schoenberg replied by restating his original demands and doubling his price. Needless to say, he did not get the job. So the conflict between these emigre artists and sort of the crass realities of commercial movie making in Hollywood forms the backbone of this book, Mercury Pictures Presents, particularly in relation to the politics and the prejudices of the war years. At the margins of Hollywood, you had people like internationally celebrated playwright Bertolt Brecht, who struggled to churn out B-movie pop boilers. You had German Jewish actors who, because of their accents, could only find work portraying the very Nazis they thought they had escaped. When the US finally entered World War II in 1941, these exiles formed the backbone of America's wartime movie propaganda apparatus. Even though as citizens of Axis countries, they were often classified as enemy aliens and denied the very rights and freedoms that their movies championed. So that's sort of the wider world of Mercury Pictures Presents, and its story is about how this unlikely group of individuals arrived in this unlikely place and transformed American culture in the process. I decided to look at this through the lens of primarily a character named Maria Lagana, who works as a junior producer at Mercury Pictures, which is a B-movie studio that becomes a hub for European exiles during this time period. And she was one of my all-time favorite characters to write. I sort of pictured her as Rosalind Russell's character in His Girl Friday, only a bit more salty and a lot more Italian. To paraphrase Billy Wilder, her job as a producer requires her to be a policeman, a midwife, a psychoanalyst, a sycophant, and a bastard. When we first meet Maria, nothing in her life is quite going right. The studio that she works at is having all sorts of financial difficulties. Her boss has recently come under investigation by isolationists in the U.S. Senate, who are investigating him for making movies that are encouraging America's entry into the conflict in Europe. And her personal life is rather complicated, to say the least. Like many characters in this book, she arrived in Hollywood while running from her past. She grew up in fascist Italy and fled to America with her mother after a childhood transgression led to her father's arrest and imprisonment. And so even though she's sort of reinvented herself as this unflappable producer, she remains haunted by the role she played in her father's fate until one day, among the various exiles who come to Mercury looking for work, she sees a man from her father's past. And with his arrival on the scene, the various lies and fictions she's spun to survive in exile begin to unravel. Right outside of Maria's office, there's a scale model miniature of the Mercury Pictures backlot itself. And over time, this became how I thought of the book as a whole. I became fascinated with the idea of this novel containing all of these different stories of characters who are coming from very different backgrounds from all across the world and landing in this one sort of dilapidated studio in this moment of crisis. And some of these are quite literally minor characters. There are two extras who hold the unofficial world record for having been killed off in the most number of movies in Hollywood history, and they dream about one day living to see the final reel. And other of these characters play a bit more substantial role in the drama, such as the German miniaturist who designed this scale model. I thought that if I could sort of connect the dots on all of these different characters, the book could perhaps show the larger humanity of this movie studio on the decline, and by doing so, demonstrate that the stories that unfold behind the camera are perhaps more interesting than those that unfold in front of it. So I'm just going to read just the first page, just to give you a sense of Maria's office space before I prattle on for a little longer. When you entered the executive offices of Mercury Pictures International, you would first see a scale model of the studio itself. Artie Feldman, co-founder and head of production, installed it in the lobby to distract skittish investors from second thoughts. Complete with backlot, sound stages, and facilities buildings, the miniature was a faithful replica of the 10-acre studio in which it sat. Maria Lagana, as rendered by the miniaturist, was a tiny, featureless figure looking out Artie's window. And this was where the real Maria stood late one morning in 1941, hands holstered on her hips, watching a pigeon autograph the windshield of her boss's new convertible. She would like to buy that bird a drink. "It's a beautiful day out, Artie," Maria said. "You really should come have a look." "I have," Artie said. "It made me want to jump." Artie wasn't known for his joie de vivre, but he usually didn't fantasize about ending it all this close to lunch. Maria wondered if the Senate investigation into motion picture war propaganda was giving him agita, but no, the crisis at hand was on his head. His bald spot had finally grown too large for his toupee to conceal. 6 other black toupees were shellacked atop wooden mannequin heads on the shelf behind his desk, where a more successful producer would display his Oscars. They were conversation starters, as in Artie began conversations with new employees by telling them the toupees were the scalps of their predecessors. As far as Maria could tell, the 6 hair pieces were the same indistinguishable model and style, but Artie had become convinced that each one crackled with the karmic energy of the hair's original head, unrealized and awaiting release, like a static charge smuggled into a fingertip. Thus, he'd renamed his toupees after their personalities: the heavyweight, the Casanova, the optimist, the Edison, the Odysseus, and the Mephistopheles. Artie had never felt more at home in his adoptive country than when he learned the founding fathers had all worn toupees. Even that showboat, John Hancock. The only one who hadn't was Benjamin Franklin. Look how he turned out. A syphilitic Francophile who got his jollies flying kites in the rain. As you can probably imagine, researching a book set in this time period, in this milieu was quite a lot of fun. Sort of any project where you can sit in your pajamas on a weekday afternoon watching old movies and calling it work is one well worth undertaking, I think. And yet some of the most interesting little nuggets and little discoveries that I made throughout the research process came from these moments of looking at how Hollywood influenced the war effort in ways that had nothing whatsoever to do with movies. And one of my favorite examples of this involves the Los Angeles airline industry. So Los Angeles had long been a hub of aviation manufacturing. Lockheed and Douglas both had large aviation facilities in Southern California. There was a story, an anecdote that's gone around. That after Pearl Harbor, there was a concern at Warner Brothers that the sound stages of the Warner Brothers backlot would be mistaken by any potential bombers as being Lockheed, and that Jack Warner had some of his artists go to the roofs of the sound stages and put big arrows on the roofs to sort of direct danger away from Warner Brothers. So following Pearl Harbor, there was this real concern that Lockheed and Douglas might be targeted, as vital aviation facilities, and had that actually happened, there would be no doubt that it would have incapacitated much of America's ability to engage in the hostilities in both Europe and the Pacific. So what these aviation plants did was they hired Hollywood set decorators, set designers, who went onto the roofs of these aviation plants and built fake suburbs. There were plywood houses that were constructed. There were trees that were built that were leaved in dyed green chicken feathers. There were inflatable cars that drove down painted on roads, and the cars were moved on this complicated system of wires. If there were any bombers coming overhead, the roofs of these aviation facilities would be completely indistinguishable from the surrounding suburbs. But what I found most remarkable was the fact that actors were brought in to essentially inhabit these spaces. So you had people playing the role of the milkman and the postal worker and the homemaker, putting sheets on the laundry line. It was this sort of scene that was as idyllic as a Norman Rockwell painting, and yet literally feet below the surface of this sort of placid, serene, pastoral vision of America, weapons of war were coming off the assembly line. So all of this was percolating in my imagination for some time when I began working on this book in 2014. At that point, I'd written 2 previous books, Constellation of Vital Phenomena and The Tsar of Love and Techno, and both of those were set in Russia. And after spending 2 books in that part of the world, I was ready to come in from the cold. And at the same time that I was kicking around this Hollywood idea, I was also thinking about a novel set in southern Italy, where some of my dad's family originates from. Now, it's going back and forth between these 2 ideas for months, unable to really settle on either. I have difficulty committing to an appetizer, let alone a multi-year book project. And things finally came together in, this must have been maybe 2015, when my wife and I went on a vacation to Lipari, which is a tiny volcanic island off the coast of Sicily, where my great-grandmother's family emigrated from. And it's absolutely gorgeous. It's one of a sort of chain of very small islands. One of them was the setting for Il Postino, if anybody saw that, just sort of these postcard beautiful islands. And on one of our last days there, we noticed this plaque that had been mounted to a wall in sort of the downtown, not downtown, it was a village, but mounted to the wall of one of the municipal buildings that commemorated the various artists and anti-fascists and intellectuals who had been sentenced by Mussolini to terms of internal exile on this island, on Lipari. And Lipari was, in fact, where Mussolini sent the majority of political prisoners during the fascist regime. And I had never heard of this particular chapter in the island's history before. There's in the living room of my childhood home, there's a painting that my dad's uncle or great uncle painted of Lipari itself, and this entire chapter was sort of missing from that history that I had heard about, this beautiful idyllic island. And it was hard to sort of square this idyllic island paradise with to which I could trace my own roots with the fact that it had been Mussolini's Alcatraz. Some German exiles referred to Los Angeles as sunny Siberia. And it occurred to me that the same term could have been applied just as easily to this Mediterranean paradise. And I realized that the Italy novel and the Los Angeles Hollywood novel weren't two separate books, but were rather halves of the same novel, and that it would tell the story of these two sunny Siberias on either end of the world, and this one family that had been divided between them. After Maria's father is arrested and sent into internal exile in southern Italy, in a town much like Lipari, Maria and her mother come to Los Angeles, and they move in with Maria's great aunts, who are three elderly widows named Mimi, Lala, and Pep. And this is sort of where the world of the book kind of intersects with my own life a little bit, because Mimi, Lala, and Pep are named after and inspired by my own great aunts. So I'm just going to read again, just like a page. In the city of angels, there was a bungalow of saints. St. Francis looked out the front window of the Lincoln Heights home Maria's great aunts, Mimi, Lala, and Pep Morabito, had shared since fleeing Calabria following the 1908 earthquake. Coming through the front door, you entered the parlor where Mimi, Lala, and Pep spent their free time hiding from their enemies' envy. There were chintz drapes, a coffee table steadied by matchbooks, a Davenport sofa that no one was ever allowed to sit on. The only book on the bookshelf was the Bible. To the bungalow's residents, Job was the most relatable character. Monday through Saturday, when Maria's great aunts ran their North Broadway restaurant, the parlor was unoccupied. On Sunday, however, it filled with widowed friends and neighbors whom Mimi, Lala, and Pep had always lived beside, first in Calico Marina and then in Lincoln Heights. In their black dresses and sunglasses, they looked like Grim Reapers going as Greta Garbo for Halloween. They played cards, kept an oral record of one another's sins in case St. Peter lost count, and cursed their enemies in ornately genealogical profanity. She is more vulgar than the sweat on the testicles of the horses that carted the coffins